So I wanted to talk about this.
Ah,
I'm not exactly sure
great.
how to summarize this, but this is an interesting paper that I ran across, or I guess it's a Substack article. This is Andres Gomez-Emillsson, and this is titled "If You Had the Whole Field, Where Would You Put It?" And so this is about thinking about Turing universality and Turing tests, but in the sense of like a mean field approach. So I don't know if you're familiar with mean field approaches. I'll talk a little bit about that. But basically, the idea that you basically have this difference between systems that are sort of like something you can give a Turing test to, or what a Turing test is, and these mean field models, especially models like cellular automata or spin glass models or things like that that exist in these fields. And we often can use those fields to characterize interactions between things, but they're not necessarily amenable to Turing tests. So at least this is what I'm understanding from this post. So uh, the subtitle here is Turing universality is universality over encodings, not over embodiments. A format general computer would accept, transform, and output physical formats directly. So basically, it's about Turing encoding being like, or Turing universality being relevant to encodings on a tape rather than, kind of phenomena in the world. And the shorthand for phenomena here is the mean field theory that he's going to talk about in this post. So this article is a follow up to this other article, which is why the principle of organizational invariance doesn't hold for continuum field systems. So this is where we're thinking about. I guess it's like kind of an interaction between philosophy and physics and computer science. So that's kind of what he's getting at here. Um, let's see. Yeah, so this article, I'm not going to go over this article too much, um, but he does talk about Chalmers' absent qualia, fading qualia, dancing qualia. This is an article by David Chalmers, who's a philosopher, and the idea here is talking about qualia and sort of this principle of organizational invariance. So this is thinking about consciousness and qualia, which is a thing in consciousness that people have tried to quantify and identify, but it's pretty elusive. So it's widely accepted that the conscious experience has a physical basis. That is, the properties of experience, which are phenomenal properties or qualia, systematically depend on physical properties according to some lawful relation. There are two key questions about this relation. The first concerns the strength of laws. Are they logically or metaphysically necessary so that consciousness is nothing over and above the underlying physical process? Or are they merely contingent laws like the law of gravity? This question about the strength of the psychophysical link is the basis for debates over physicalism and property dualism. That's the first thing, is the strength of the laws. And the second question concerns the shape of the laws. Precisely how do phenomenal properties depend on physical properties? What sort of physical properties enter into the law's antecedents, for instance, and consequently, what sort of physical systems can give rise to conscious experience? And so in this paper, he's going to focus on the second question, which is the shape of the laws. So, this kind of sets us up for this idea of, what kinds of computational structures can be used to sort of produce this sort of behavior that might be sort of considered conscious or more conscious than other types of structures. I guess that's kind of where this is going. Um, Now, going back to this article, to put the issue differently, Even once it is accepted that experience arises from physical systems, the question remains open. In virtue of what sort of physical properties does conscious experience arise? Some properties that brains can possess will presumably be among them, but it is far from clear just what the relevant properties are. Some have suggested biochemical properties, some have suggested quantum mechanical properties, many have professed uncertainty. So this is kind of talking about, what kind of system can produce a conscious response. And what he's kind of getting at here is that, of course, brains can do this, perhaps. Not all brains, but maybe some brains. Of course, there may be biochemical properties, so maybe it isn't a property of the brain, and in this case, it would be neurons that are connected into circuits and into pathways and things like that. But sometimes, people have proposed that they're biochemical sort of substrates to consciousness. So there are things like ORCHOR, which is a hypothesis about consciousness, or there are other types of maybe biochemical substrates for consciousness. So that may be one place where we can look for sort of the roots or the structure of consciousness. We might also have quantum mechanical properties. So it may be a quantum mechanical phenomena, which could be, anything could be conscious at that point. But of course, this is all speculation and no one's really proven anything. But it does give us this interesting kind of concept to think about, which is that a system's functional organization is key to how experience arises in a physical system. And that's kind of what we're getting at in the posts, in the Substack posts, is that there's this certain structure that we need to have for certain types of experience to become manifest. On this view, the chemical and indeed the quantum substrates of the brain are not directly relevant to the existence of consciousness, although they may be indirectly relevant. What is central, rather, is that the brain's abstract causal organization, an organization that might be realized in many different physical substrates. And so this is where he defends this idea of organizational invariance, holding that experience is invariant across systems with the same fine-grained functional organization. So this principle states that any given system that has conscious experiences, they have the same functional organization, and a fine enough brain will have quantitatively identical conscious experiences. And so this is kind of where this is going. And this is kind of the background. So Chalmers' paper is the background to this post, which is this why the principle of organizational invariance doesn't hold for continuum field systems. And this is just saying that these kind of mean field models don't have this kind of organizational invariance. And then, of course, in the other posts that I wanted to highlight, it's where he's comparing mean field theory and sort of the Turing machine, or the Turing, the kind of thing we think about when we think about digital computation. So this is going back to this post. If you had the whole field, where would you put it? So let's start off here at the beginning here. Suppose I hand you the complete state of a field with everything specified: amplitudes, phases, boundary conditions, topological invariance, coherent relations, and couplings to the environment. The information is exhaustive. Where do you put it? So the idea is you have this field of physical information. So in a lot of physics models, we might build a field which has a number of different properties to it. So if we want to have a physical description of the world, we might have like a quantum field model where we have all sorts of information about the quantum states across that field. And we have to store that somewhere. And a lot of times we have to store that in some sort of abstraction. And the question is it computable? If we can put it in an abstraction that's computable, that's fine. But if we can't, then we have a problem that is where something is maybe not computable in a digital sense. So a Turing machine has one answer available on the tape as a sequence of marks over a finite alphabet. So a Turing machine, as a definition of computation, is actually quite limiting. So, we have this difference between sort of quantum field, which is itself a description of reality, which may or may not capture everything in reality, but is the kind of description we might not use in computation, but rather use in terms of mathematical notation. And then to compute that, we have to build a Turing machine, at least in digital computing terms. We have to build a Turing machine that can then do those computations and provide a Turing complete description, which allows us to transition between states and do computation in a digital sense. So at this point, I want to go back to some figures here. So if we look at a Turing machine, we see that this is your typical Turing machine. You have a tape, and when he says a tape, it's, this is thinking about a theoretical Turing machine or a theoretical digital computer, where you have this one-dimensional tape that has a series of binary states, zeros and ones. And so this is where you're storing your field information. And of course, naturally, this is going to be incomplete because whereas you can store some of this information, you can't access all of it. So you have this infinite tape that goes, and theoretically it can go on forever. And then you have this read-write head that will read each of these states, and they'll read them across the tape. And then they have to figure out where to halt or where to complete the computation. And so this is a problem that, of course, is very limiting for digital computers and is even more limiting in terms of how we interpret the world or how we interpret models of the world. And so this is another example of a Turing machine where we have our tape, we have different states on the tape, it's scrolling by the head or the observer, and the observer is reading things and halting and doing these things that resemble a program, where the program is the tape head has to read the states, has to think about the states, has to write states out, off of the tape into the computer, and has to move the tape in accordance with all these different computational operations it might do. So that's a Turing machine. Then of course there is this field model, and of course field models are used often in physics, but one variant of a field model is an Ising model. So this is an Ising model. This is one of the sort of first field models that led to some of the work in cellular automata. And an Ising model is a model of magnetic spins. So this is it was originally a tool in physics where you had this field where you had a bunch of basically, well, sometimes they call them spin glass models, where you have a bunch of physical constituents and they're moving around on this lattice, and they're moving in different states. So sometimes they have a state that's up and a state that's down. They can have a state that's positive, they can have a state that's negative if it's a magnetic system. Basically, you have this system of parallel constituents that have a binary state or have some set of discrete states that can be recorded at any given time. So you have the system of these, say, like, let's take a series of magnetic balls or metal balls, and they're subject to a magnetic field. And they have this, they're all kind of behaving in parallel. Some of them spin up and some of them spin down. And then we record their state at a certain time. And then this is the map of these states. It's kind of hard to see this. But basically, this is where we have a bunch of states that are up, which is in red, and a bunch of states that are down, which is in the light blue. And so then we can record that state of that field, and that's kind of similar to our state on the tape of a Turing machine. And then from there we can actually, because we're taking the snapshot of the system, we can treat that like a binary state. But instead of having a single sort of serial state, we have these parallel states. And so we have a lot more information than we have with our typical Turing test. So that suggests some sort of parallel computing paradigm. Now, this is just kind of an example of a field. We have one piece of the field's information here embodied in this model. So if we look at like models like cellular automata, we know that like each cell in a cellular automata is, maybe like a Turing machine, but then we have these things arrayed in parallel, which of course we could just say, well, we could just do parallel digital computation and be done with it. Except that those things that are happening in parallel interact with each other. And so it is with the Ising model or any other field model where your constituents that are next to one another tend to interact with one another. And so as they interact, they actually can influence each other's state, which is not something you see if you were to just simply array a bunch of Turing machines and in parallel. So this is another aspect of field models that are unique. And this is another example of an Ising model. Again, this is a very small image. I'm sorry about the quality, but you have this, these parallel states that you can build a map of. And the key here is that they interact with each other as much as they change over time. So we have this dynamics, but we also have these series of interactions happening. So he points to this, this problem where you have this field that we want to characterize, and we have a complete state, and we need to put this information somewhere to compute it. And so we have in a Turing machine, we can put this on a tape, but as I just mentioned, there are a lot of problems with characterizing this field as a tape, as a sequence, as a serial sequence, and not even as a parallel sequence or sequences in parallel. The tape is the only format the machine can accept, store, transform, or emit. So the field, qua field, is gone. So we just, a lot of times in computer science, we take things in the real world and we abstract them to some level of abstraction. Sometimes that level of abstraction is so great that we lose a lot of information in the process. If we think about biological systems, we often do this all the time with respect to, if we're looking at gene expression, for example, we take measurements of gene expression, which are distinct measurements, which don't really necessarily account for the dynamics. And then we reduce that to a number. And then we reduce that to maybe differences in the number. And then we kind of build a model from that. But of course, that obscures a lot of the noise, a lot of the fluctuation. We could record things like we do in neuroimaging as sort of a continuous time series, but we might record it from one site. And these individual recordings don't necessarily capture emergent effects or other types of effects in other sites in the brain. So there's always a limit to what we can measure. There's always a limit to what we can compute and represent. So this is kind of thinking about the tape. What remains on the tape is a description of the field, which lives in a totally different causal format than the field did. So not only is it that we lose information by abstracting things, it's also that we have this lack of causality. And so we can't necessarily capture, say, those interactions between the constituents in an Ising model or in a cellular automata. Even if we have a series of Turing tapes or Turing machines in parallel, we still can't capture those interactions. So that's kind of, the tape does not exert stresses or carry flux. It does not sustain phase relations, preserve topological defects, or couple to charges the way the field did. And remember, this is just a description of like a physical field where we're dealing with things like magnetism, quantum effects, interactions, things like that. So this is just in physics. So we're thinking about something like a human behavioral system. We have even more complex things to worry about. Or if we're thinking about a brain, we have a lot of things that are maybe above and beyond the physical aspects to think about. it can be used to reconstruct something with those causal powers given an interpreter and a lot of extra machinery. So we can actually approximate these kinds of things with a digital computer. But the reconstruction is then being done by the interpreter and the machinery, not by the tape. So the tape is sort of the core of the system, and we're kind of augmenting it, but it becomes a problem in terms of putting that all together as a computational system. So if we can't represent things by the tape of the Turing machine, then the relevant computer can no longer just be the Turing machine. The thing that took the description and turned it back into a physical object is doing essential work. This is the distinction that classical computation tends to hide. Stephen Lahar made a related point about perception years ago, distinguishing rendered from encoded representations. So this is where, if you look at the visual system, it does not just encode the world in symbolic activations. Rather, it renders an explicit spatial object in some field-like medium. So this is an interesting point in a lot of models of computational neuroscience, or even if you're thinking about building a model of perception in an AI system. You have to think about what the perceptual system is actually doing. So it's not that you're encoding the world as a set of symbols, or you're encoding the world as a set of zeros and ones. You have to render sort of the spatial objects in the world and have a reference point. So it's not just enough to have take inputs from the sensory world and transform them into a matrix and then operate on that matrix and say that's visual perception or that's some other type of cognition. You actually have to have these, I wouldn't even say manifolds because that's maybe too simplistic. You have to have this reference frame, and then you have to have the actual representations of the spatial objects in some way, in some field-like medium. So that could be something like an Ising model or some sort of parallel computational model, or it could just be something that we haven't really characterized yet. But it's a field-like medium in the sense that it's something embedded in some larger reference frame. So that's kind of, and this is, I don't know if this is also making the distinction between sort of conventional perceptual psychophysics and ecological psychology, but that's a tantalizing sort of connection there that might actually also be interesting. And a lot of the ecological psychologists talk about, how they complain about the way that cognitive scientists treat representations. And maybe this is kind of leading us to that question in a different way. So anyways, back to the world of Turing machines. Turing machines are universal over encodings, not over embodiments. So they're like Turing machines deal with just these simple encodings, and they have this universality that is relevant to encoding. So in other words, you could take any problem, turn it into a binary, a string, and operate on that string. And that's kind of the universality that Turing machines live at. But a lot of systems, of course, are embodied and need this embodiment in the world. And so when you have this embodiment in the world, you have to use something like a field model to represent that. And so, in an embodied system, your field model, it can also be universal. So you can have a lot of things that can be represented in these field models. So if you're familiar with the work on cellular automata, there's a claim of universality of cellular automata, which are, of course, where you can represent a wide variety of physical systems using that kind of model. But it's different than what you can claim to be universal with the Turing machine. So the gap between these two kinds of universality, the Turing machine, the tape, and the field model, may matter for some of the longer running puzzles in philosophy of mind. So he's kind of focusing on philosophy of mind, but I also think if you say philosophy of computation, that's probably also true. So there's a slogan, Turing universality is universality over encodings, not over embodiments. And, this is again stressing that a Turing machine can emulate any computable target process as a string transformation, but it doesn't thereby instantiate the target process in the target process's native physical format. Given the Turing machine, give the Turing machine a soap film, which is like, if you have a layer of soap bubbles, a coherent quantum state, which is, a series of quantum states, a vortex knot, a high entropy alloy, or a Lehar style perceptual field, which we talked about earlier, and it doesn't accept that objects as input in its native form. It accepts a symbolic encoding of the object. So you might have to transform all of those things in that field to a series of letters or a series of numbers. And this, of course, limits the expressivity of that encoding, and it also limits what you can actually encode. And it doesn't output a field configuration either, only a description of one. So you don't actually get the entire field configuration. You only get a description of that field configuration and hope that it's enough information to produce something that's useful. Yeah, so he goes through a lot of things about actuators and, kind of maybe some of the solutions to this, which are, things that are working from the Turing. So I mentioned before that, like, you have your Turing machine, but you also have actuators that allow you to sort of augment what the Turing machine is not able to represent. And so that's what he's talking about here with these actuators. So you could, of course, drive a physical actuator that instantiates the described configuration. So it might be taking, an encoding from a Turing machine and using, let's say, like a 3D printer to build the model of what's described in the Turing machine, or a magnetic field generator that reproduces the system that's encoded in the Turing machine, or some other type of laser array or something like that, some other way to instantiate things back into the physical world. So you can do that, but at the end you have a field, and the question is, can you reproduce that field given that transformation into a Turing machine and then back to the physical world? And that's, sometimes that works and sometimes it doesn't. And of course, then there are all these different aspects of causality where, can we really capture the causality of physical systems using Turing machines? So a Turing machine is one primitive operation: read a mark, write a mark, move the head, change the state. Of course, if you can capture causality through that, great. If you can't, then you have a problem. And of course, other physical systems have other primitives, and the difference is not always reducible to different implementations of the same operation. So again, this idea of Turing machine being universal is limited to the things that a Turing machine can compute faithfully. And for a lot of physical systems, it may or may not be the case, especially if you're interested in causality. So this just shows this is a vibe-coded simulation of the reverse Grassfire algorithm proposed by Stephen Lehar. So this is a Lehar version of perception. This is the reverse Grassfire algorithm, which I'm not familiar with, but this is like kind of a simulation of this. This is how perceptual behavior is encoded in these spatial objects embedded in a field, basically. So this is where you have a neural field given inputs and a coupling structure that settles into resonant modes whose stability is determined by the field equations and the boundary equations. The refined spatial structure that results as the output, and Lehar's claim translated into computational terms, is that perception works this way. So the visual system doesn't produce a symbolic conclusion, such as a triangle, but a reified field format object, like a triangle present in the visual field, is a spatial entity. So you understand what I'm saying here is that there isn't a symbol that's fixed like a triangle. It's rather that there's an object that is shaped like a triangle present in a visual field. So the triangle is a spatial entity. maybe forms what we could call a triangle, but it isn't like symbolically a triangle because there's a lot of variation across like different percepts and things like that. But it produces something that statistically resembles a triangle. I know that's kind of a maybe an exercise in semantics, but there is a difference in terms of how that is computationally represented. So this is an important point, is that sometimes we're dealing with things that we can maybe minimize to symbols, but don't actually behave like the symbols that we kind of fit them into. And then, of course, we're always dealing with a black box problem. So a lot of times when we look at physical systems and we observe them and try to model them, sometimes we have problems understanding the actual causality of things or the actual mechanism of things. So if we look in classical electromagnetism, we might ask the question, what does it really mean for one part of a continuous field to cause another part to take a certain value? So if we remember our field from the if we remember our field from the Ising model, we have different regions of this field, spatial regions, that might be influenced by interactions between the neighboring constituents, but they might also influence other parts of the field. So you have, maybe one part of this field influencing another part of this field. Now, we don't know necessarily what the causal structure of this is. We just know that we might observe, one part of the field maybe change to a upward spin, and then another part of the field changing to an upward spin. And we might say that one part of the field causes another part of the field to take on that state. But of course, as we know from like correlation matrices in connectomes, that's a limited sort of causality. We can associate two things if they're correlated in the same way and say that those things are obviously connected. But that's not always the case. We don't understand the causality. So the causality in that sense is as a black box. So that's what he points to here as the black box problem, where you really need, if you really want to understand causality, you really need to have an external observer who can observe things at the right granularity and have the right variables available to it. And a lot of times we don't have that kind of observer. We don't have that kind of information. So the causal structure of a continuous physical system is something we model, parameterize, and interrogate, but it isn't given to us in any direct way as a finite list of what causes what. So again, we have a problem with causality, not just in terms of understanding what's inside the box and what the mechanisms are, but do we know what, we don't really have like a parts list of causality. In other words, every interaction that exists in a system, in a field, we don't know what causes what. We don't have the inventory. We only can observe things and then kind of figure out if something is causal or not, and it's not particularly informative. So the risk then is if you replace the pocket with a lookup table that captures its observed behavior on the cases you tested, you remove the actual causal structure and kept only the input-output map. So this is an important thing in a lot of digital computing, is that we often use lookup tables to capture sort of this relationship between things. And that doesn't give us causality, that just gives us a lookup table, a correspondence. And so we keep the input-output map, and a lot of times when we characterize physical systems that we might characterize using a field, we lose a lot of that causality, and we're just left with a set of correspondences. And so this is a problem that I think is overlooked in a lot of our modeling and a lot of the ways in which we use digital computing. So a lot of really interesting things in this article. The final part of this article is where he says the tape is not enough. So the right question to ask of a candidate substrate isn't, is it Turing complete? That's the wrong universality for these purposes. A Turing machine is universal over descriptions, and descriptions are an enormously powerful medium. So when we build a Turing machine, we build this machine that's universal over descriptions. So whatever description we're dealing with, as long as it kind of fits the format of a Turing machine, we can use that to model its output, and that's been an enormously effective thing over time. There's an unreasonable effectiveness essentially. It's like there's a paper called The Unreasonable Effectiveness of Mathematics. We could say that there's also an unreasonable effectiveness of Turing machines and of this sort of uh, universality over descriptions. But of course, if we're dealing with things that are native to a field, such as the mind, or such as a lot of physical systems, and he brings up field theories of consciousness here, um, they require something else: the universality over formats, the ability to compose fields, resonances, topological pockets, surfaces, and continuous dynamics as native computational primitives. These are very different from the Turing machine paradigm, where we have a tape that we're reading from a tape serially. And one that's been settled by a famous theorem isn't necessarily the one that matters here. So if you had the whole field, where would you put it? You can't put it on a tape unless you're willing to lose the field and keep only its recipe. The only place to put a field without changing what it is in a field. So you need to have a field to represent a field. But we just need to have that model. We need to have richer computational models for a lot of the kinds of problems that we're dealing with. And it's maybe digital computers are good enough, but probably not. And so that's kind of he links us to consciousness and by extension biological systems. But I also think it's the case that there are a lot of things that a lot of trade-offs we make in deciding what to represent in a model. Like if we're modeling anything, it could be a physical system, it could be a very simple physical system, it could be a social system. We just have to, kind of make those choices and hope for the best. And maybe if we had sort of these native ways to represent things better, like if we started off, say, not with a tape but with a field. So we didn't, have a Turing test, but we had kind of like a Ising test. We might have a better sense of some of these more complex problems.
Hold on, I was just about to say something kind of cool, and then I lost. Oh, whatever. I just got this weird message. Anyway, yeah, I just, as you're writing that, I posted some comments on the article, so I don't. You can share the screen and see the comments if you refresh the page or not. Doesn't matter. But yeah, like I really like this article. It kicks it, and it's nice. I like it because it's cool, but also because it 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 connects the dots on many things from like the cognition futures space. And even like at the end, I was like going to mention every good regulator theorem and our classic thing about do you have enough? Do you have enough? Um, I don't know, variety is the right word to use here, but are you able to account for the different states that the thing has? And so it was a really nice piece. I saw part of the piece earlier, and then it was nice to go through it because I didn't get to go through it fully. But like I really like even just the phrase "where do you put a whole field?" Like it's a very clever way of getting at this thing. And one in the comments, I think one of the comments I made as we were writing this just now was about it's a nice way to get at a lot of this big divide right now. Um, Maybe not a big divide, but it's something that I particularly feel along the lines of if if your main experience in interpreting a lot of things is um, working with bits and bytes, like digital data or digital media, I think there's a very particular um, divide emerging between that and then the people who are dealing with like obviously biological data in particular or biological um, matter, no less hardware. and that's coming like the ease of making a completely digital startup or a business or a concept, and now the LLMs and how easy it is to interact with Claude Code to do things in that space versus these sort of, concrete realities and practical issues of dealing with things that aren't in that space. And I think this sort of ties into all of that in the sense of, um, we've talked a lot in the past about like reductionism. We've talked a lot in the past about these, the unreasonable effectiveness of why certain things that have been reduced are the way they are. And so I think it's kind of pointing out. um, I'm reminded a little bit of the David Krakauer podcast that I mentioned a while ago with Krakauer and Mindscapes with, I think, Sean Carroll. And, it kind of points at this like, yes, the way things have developed have been really, really great. And even like sympathetically, the way, the throwing the entire field away to be able to focus on what the Turing machine can do, and being able to just use that process of like the way the observer is, and I like the observer, the head, the way the thing looking at it is stripped down. Like, yes, there's a tremendous amount of things it can do, and it's just offering this sense of, okay, that is one way, and it probably, in many ways, in many like civilization, like almost a Sid Meier's civilization, if you will, like civilization levels development of like, sure, your computing machinery uh, takes the Turing machine archetype as sort of what it's trying to do, and it's like, yes, that may, I would say there's a reason for why it developed that way, because you can because of what you're abstracting out, um, makes it so easy to focus on these simplified things. But the paper, I think, is a very nice way to kind of get at, okay, well, what really does really put like you have, uh, where did you put the rest of the field, and how it's universal in this sense, but not universal in the embodiment sense, not universal in all these nuances that are kind of abstracted out or compressed or simply just removed. And I think it's a nice gesture towards uh, that problem and that opportunity, to sort of reclaim those things. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up Krakauer and some of the things there, because I know we've been talking about Krakauer and his approach. But this other thing is, there is this whole field of programming with matter, and like it seems like that's a kind of a weird thing to say, but there are a lot of people who, well, we've talked about unconventional computing and how people use things like slime molds or other types of biological systems to do computation. There's this other field of people computing with matter, so they're doing things like using soft active materials, like we talked about from the DeVore meeting, where you're building these basically these physical fields of particles, and then you're computing those particles or computing their interactions. It's a very different paradigm than digital computing using a Turing test or using a Turing model, because you're basically you're dealing with things that aren't totally discrete states. You're dealing with collective behavior. You're dealing with other types of phenomena that are different than what you would encounter in a Turing computer. So this is like, and of course, it's not built like, it's not necessarily digital computation. This overlaps with what we've talked about in terms of physical computation, but and it requires a different kind of characterization of what computation is. So it requires a different type of test. Instead of a Turing test, like I said, you might have an Ising test, which is like, is this system, is this interacting system able to say maybe produce coherent states, macro states? Is it able to do things like produce emergent phenomena? Is it able to sort of have constituents that can kind of behave autonomously instead of being influenced by its neighbor? There are a lot of questions there about the field itself and about like parallel behavior of parallel constituents that's important. Because if we do parallel computation, what we're doing essentially is creating a bunch of threads or throwing a job to different processors, and those things are all just kind of happening in parallel. So we just have Turing machines that are just kind of running in parallel. And then those
Mm.
things are then assembled at the end of the job, and then we have our parallel computing paradigm. And that's basically the way we do parallel computing. But like imagine if you had everything in one place. They weren't like kind of in parallel in the sense of being run separately, but they were all interacting over the course of the job. And then you have these things that emerge through the process of running a job that then are unique. You can't do that by dividing up a job and putting it on different threads or in different processors. And so, being able to characterize, say, a lot of things like emergent phenomena, or maybe things like just characterizing strong or weak interactions, globally as well as locally, instead of just maybe taking little pieces of a field and computing them in a separate thread and then putting them together and saying, well, there were these local interactions, and then maybe we'll do another run where there are global interactions, and then we can kind of reconstruct things from there. It does lead you to this idea of experience. Like, if the system is about, like, if you want to capture the behavior of a system, it's not just about the physical parameters, but about the experience of the interactions. So all of the parts of the system have to experience the interactions kind of in the same context, in that same spatial context, in order to really be a good reconstruction. And you can't do that with a Turing model or Turing computation.
I'm trying to formulate this question, and it's basically about that, and it's basically about the head or the observer. And
Yeah,
I'm glad you said observer
yeah,
specifically in the sense of like, and this is reminds me a little bit of what we were getting at a long time ago in the shared cognitive environments poster from Cognition Futures. I never really developed this, but it's like I don't know how to formulate this question yet, but it's essentially in that model you have this observer head that's doing the observing, reading, and thinking all at one thing. And so I don't know, like, and I don't know if this is a physical computing um, place to look at this or otherwise, but sort of like what are the options for augmenting or changing the head of the observer itself, which is like both the observer, which is like a broad concept, but then like also the in the machine sense of the head. Like you, is it? Can you? Are there experiments about how to change that, or like different architectures entirely, or is that just sort of? I don't know how to rigorously approach that question. Is that Does that make sense?
yeah. So I think in the article, if you had the whole field, he mentioned that there are like these augmentations that you can use. So like you can have a Turing machine, and it can read the states, and it can put things into a memory where you can then access them and think about them, as it were. But you also have these devices like 3D printers. So you could take a 3D printer, hook that up to the Turing machine, that prints out the physical instantiation of this field. Or if you're like modeling something like a set of gears, you could like take the physical instantiation of that, reduce it to a Turing complete description that is binary um, digits, read the tape as it's moving, and then reconstruct from that. Maybe using like a higher level programming language and physical descriptions of the symbols. Some sort of model, and then use a 3D printer to print that all out as a physical reproduction. So you can augment the system that way using like higher level programming languages, these kind of devices that put things back into the physical world. So like sensors and other types of devices can you be augment basically the head. But I think what you mean though is, could you augment the head, say at the level of machine code, to make this process richer? And that's going to maybe a bottleneck. I don't know if you could do that But it is interesting to think about like a model of computation where you had access to all this information and you had your thing that's sort of reading the computational structure as an observer. So it could be like that tape head as an observer, or like an observer in a field. It's observing different parts of the field, different local states, different global states, and it's putting all of that together. You could have maybe 1,000 observers in a field that are looking at different aspects of the field and then
Yeah,
reconstructing all of that.
right. And I feel like I feel like I'm very interested in that space in the sense that I don't know, and I think I haven't done my due diligence to really investigate it, but it's come up. I don't really know what to call that. It's sort of like how would like shared code in an environment sense, the idea at the time was to have, you know, like a VR medium that would somewhat offer not what it was like in somebody else's head kind of a thing, but loosely gesturing towards that. And I that's way pie in the sky stuff in one sense, but even just like where is it? There's a certain element of like some of it feels quite fanciful and the impossibility of like you as me as an individual biological agent and the inability to because you can like I could have empathy for someone else's experience. I can simulate, I can do theory of mind, I can gain this way to internally, you know, mirror or represent or whatever. But there's sort of a certain I am not getting uh, I'm not seeing through Morgan's eyes. I'm not seeing through Bradley's eyes directly. Like there's a certain substrate discreteness, and it's like, well, is are there any articulate or interesting ways to get around that, or is that like that it's a very old problem in many ways, the inside outside and so on and so on. But I'm curious. I don't know. Like I feel like so open ended in even my sort of ambitious aspirational takes, and then my here's hard limitations that we have to deal with. So I don't even know how to really address that space, but I feel like that's an interesting space to try to be rigorous about. That kind of dips into phenomenology and kind of doesn't. Both from like the computational machinery thing. This this machine or this entity. It's almost like saying, well, is it one is the observer a one machine or is it two machines? Is it one entity? Is it multiple agents that are coordinated? Is it a combined intelligence? Like, how does that work? And I don't know. I don't have any real. I have a bunch more can of worms than anything else, but it's an interesting space.
Like tape heads as
But
combined intelligence.
What's that?
Tape heads as combined intelligence.
Um, and like it's sort of like it kind of gets like the tesseract as the square, the shadow of the cube and the shadow of the square things like you can kind of make out, but it's really hard to imagine like what would a multiple tape head setup actually be or do, or like how would it there have to be some kind of would there be a shared internal substrate of the mapping part that has different inputs and outputs like I'm sure there are people that have done some work in this space theoretically, and I don't really know. Um, I don't have strong opinions about it, but regardless of that can of worms, like I'm really glad. I don't know if I saw this paper and I was hoping to have more time in it, so I don't know if I shared it with you or you saw it, but I'm really glad that we went through Andre's stuff here because it's something I really wanted to cover in a kind of a classic cognition future sense, but also just everything else, you know, it's a line of discussion that we've had going for a long time now in the lab too.
Right. Yeah, I think it goes back to the physical computation stuff we did a couple years ago. And then I like, he does approach this from kind of the theory of mind or the philosophy of mind kind of approach. So, like, there is, of course, all this work in philosophy of mind about consciousness and about observers and about computation and the role of computation and consciousness. And it's a huge mess. As I think I've made the point before, where it's like, a lot of this is just kind of like, um, you know, theorizing without very much experimental rigor and or computational rigor even. But I mean, I think like maybe we don't focus so much on the philosophy of mind and think about like more of the philosophy of computation or maybe some of these kind of alternative forms of computation that that occur in nature. I mean, people have argued that the brain is a computer, but when they usually do that, they're arguing kind of that the brain is a digital computer that you can perform a Turing test on. Or we had this whole discussion. But then
I have
maybe.
I
Oh, go ahead.
I'm sorry.
Oh,
I have to finish the
yeah, go ahead.
paper on your mind is a blank.
Oh, yeah,
I
yeah.
keep because I keep referencing that paper all the time in my mind, and I keep referencing this and like, oh, like Elon Barinholtz is all about LLMs and what LLM means and reveal about how we think about XYZ. Like that's great, and then you have it comes up so often, and it's like I have to get wade through things to get it just pre-print out so I can do it. So I don't know. This is like an essay series, and there's actually going to be a paper too. So if people are interested in that, or if I can get, it's on the docket.
Yeah.
It's just I love feedback and people want to flesh that out with me. You're welcome to do that. But
Yeah.
it's super relevant here too because it's always like, oh, here's the thing, and this is it, and now, well, we know how this works, so now we know how that works. Like, okay,
Yeah.
but yes, yeah,
Yeah, that they've had many metaphors for the brain over history, and it hasn't always been a computer. And I think the metaphor is like of a digital computer, but like consider that the brain maybe is a com- natural computer, which is totally where the rules are totally different than like a Turing machine in terms of how it works and how you can test if it's computation. The intuition may be somewhat correct, but like the mechanism isn't.
well,
um,
and that's where like
yeah,
I wish I knew enough of Michael Levin's ideas to articulate them in the context of like, uh, what was it, mind something all the way down, something all the way up, and cognition all the way
cognition.
down,
Yeah,
and what was it, machines all the way up or something like that? I
yeah,
forget what his
something like
latest
that.
version of
Yeah,
it. But just the competing takes on that, and then yes, going back to kind of the David Krakauer like telenomic matter stuff. Like I think I think I think one of in the ultimate view, I would speculate. Going back to the Turing machine itself and the infinite tape stuff is like there's a reason why, like, as much as I'm kind of poking fun with your mind as a blank in my approach to it a few moments ago, I think the implication of the paper is that, and this is also something else I have to flesh out. Uh, the implication, because I have like a graph about this that I want. It's very clear in my mind that I haven't materialized it in an artifact form yet. But the implication of the mind paper is like, in popular culture, yes, like in a popular means, if it's a bass or a piano or an instrument or a general computer or a machine or a computer or a digital computer or LM, that's sort of, it's kind of like the phrase. I don't even know if people say this anymore, but it used to be a while ago. AI is anything that your computer can't do, right?
yeah,
Like things like that. Like there's a sort of like the abstract qualities of someone or something, um, is everything that blank current example can't do. And so that's part of it. But the other broader implication is like, there's a requisite vantage point, one of my old favorite terms. There's a requisite vantage point that you have to be able to access to understand the paths that were taken or not taken and how the conceptualization has occurred. And what I mean by that, hopefully a bit more concretely, is the sort of path dependence and implication from, not implication, the path dependence and why the Turing machine and its usefulness for what it's allowed us to kind of highlight on and do is great, but there's a sort of you kind of have to build with the limited tools inherently before you can jump to other perspectives as well. There's sort of this requisite development of building out these nuggets or processes too. So the sympathetic view of the mind as a blank jest or like poking fun is that, well, like you have to do that. There's not really a shortcut. It kind of, and again, the Sid Meier's civilization said you can't really just leapfrog like, oh, we figured out calculus and now we're at quantum computing. Like there's sort of an inherent incremental inadequate scaffolding. And then I think that's sort of the heart of, if you were to extrapolate like Richard Sutton's bitter lesson to some extent, like that's a very specific commentary on like computational stuff, but in it to very to take gigantic liberties and borrow some of the spirit of it right now, I'd say like it's sort of an intentional focus on the broader awareness of that process as a whole. Like okay, we don't want to over optimize towards LLMs right now. It's realizing there will eventually be something more than, LLMs. It's like that's okay, and you got to keep expanding that overall space as opposed to say, okay, LLMs are the thing that's going to provide super intelligence and AGI and solve all our problems. And you can say that deep learning or like whatever it was,
Yeah.
Anyway, I'm rambling, and we can. Oh boy, it's quite later than I realized. So we should probably go soon.
Yeah. Why don't we call it a meeting? So thank you for that conversation. It's very good. I think it's something we should follow up on, definitely.